So part one talked about basically the start of this industrial revolution and then the social effects of the industrial revolution. But now we're going to get into the economic effects of the industrial revolution. And here's where you got to kind of remember back to some of the American history that you might have learned once upon a time. But we're going to be talking about goods being made more efficiently. And whenever you see this word efficiently, that means people are trying to find the simplest way to make things, which lowers the waste and increases the production of things. So that means more money. The supply of goods are going to go way, way up. And when there's a lot of something, that means the prices are going to go down. So, this relationship for us as consumers is great. But if you're a business owner and you're sitting on a lot of goods, that's not a good thing because nobody's buying it. So, why does this matter for us? Also, is because people are working. When people are working, usually the economy is going to be okay for a while until it's not. Then you're going to look at the more consumer demand due to lowered prices. They're going to notice that when people keep making and yet people are still buying, that's going to create future problem. And that's what happened in the depression of the United States. But when you go into the jobs that were created during this time, I mean, I've already kind of touched on that, but in the social classes being created, I've already kind of talked about that as well. But again, these are all economic things. You could make the argument that there's some are social, but sure. But here are some of the different inventions that are coming around during the time. And if you look at some of them, they're the basis of some of our early or some of our things we use today. So cotton gin we use because obviously we still wear clothes. Telegraph becomes telephones, which becomes other ways of communicating. Sewing machines, pretty self-explanatory. But the transatlantic cable, this is going to be the ways to communicate across the ocean, which communication moving as fast as possible is a ginormous thing. I already talked about the telephone. Light bulb is going to be a big deal because now it's going to replace kerosene and oil. Automobiles, talking about Henry Ford. In this case, Carl Benz is really the first person to come up with the automobile. Radios, if you remember back in American history, people having those in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Airplanes are going to now be a thing in this time period as well, improving travel and such. And then the assembly line was really perfected, not the idea of, but perfected by Henry Ford, going back to that efficiency, if you will. But all of these things came about because of the demand, the want, if you will. And they're going to be innovated down the line. So, this now creates another discussion in history where you talk about which is better capitalism, which is everything we just talked about supply, demand, factors of production, people owning things privately and making a huge profit, or the treatment of people. And this is really like the factory workers of the time. We talked about last lesson about how their lives were not good, being taken advantage of by longing working hours, dangerous working conditions, creating the separation of the really rich and the not really rich, the poor, if you will. And this is going to be seen as a downfall of mankind by this guy. This is Karl Marx. He's going to come up with this idea of socialism where he wants everybody to be treated the same. He wants no social classes. Where Adam Smith, this guy up here, the founder or I guess the father of capitalism, is going to say capitalism is a good thing. So both ends of the spectrum, both are being represented during the time, but now officially being talked about. And this is stuff that's talked about even to this day. But in terms of why this all matters is that these clashes between these two ideas is what's going to spark different reform movements that you've seen in American history, starting labor unions, and then eventually making their way into different laws established in different countries. So what a trust is kind of like something like a monopoly. If you're the only group that makes a certain product, that's like a trust, if you will. And in this case, it's labor. So the supply of goods increased during the Industrial Revolution, led to the price of goods blank. So again, supply goes up, the price of goods went where? So here's a chart that's going to break down capitalism and socialism just a little bit more. And if you look at it, socialism is talking about treating people equally, I guess you would say. And then in capitalism is what's created to guess, separate people, I guess you would say. So, in true capitalism, there is no government interaction. The government should not interfere in any single way, which is said right down here. But in socialism, they're basically saying things are controlled, they're fixed, if you will. And this is what's eventually going to lead into communism, okay, which is going to be a thing that we're going to talk about in Unit 6. But why this matters to us is that this clash is still a thing. So if you remember in American history, people called the New Deal socialist because it made wages the same, all controlled by the government, and it eliminated basically the capital demand supply thought. So, good point of reference here. But then you got to get into the other side effects of the Industrial Revolution, and it's going to lead to imperialism because now people are making things. They're going to need the materials to make said things. So you've seen this definition a few times in this American and world history course, where imperialism is the takeover of a country or a territory by a stronger nation with the intent of dominating the, in this case, economic life of people of that nation. And this is right in the wheelhouse of the Industrial Revolution. And you're going to notice that when now that kind of slavery is seen as like a tisk task thing, like you shouldn't really do it, like, all right, fine, we'll just go to your country and we'll take you over on your own land. So we've talked about this a couple of different ways. And this is going to lead to a birth of nationalism and social Darwinism, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But then it's also going to start the whole idea of racism, that one race is better than the other. In this case, it's mostly European races are going to be better than others. And they're going to establish colonies all over the world, which we've already kind of again talked about. And the social Darwinism is when you get into the whole debate of just because we can, should we? And only the stronger races will survive. So this is actually has a term, and it was once upon a time called the white man's burden. Should we do it because we can, or should we just let them fail out? So I'll let you be the judge to that about history's interpretation. But then there also isn't happening during the time of you needed to Christianize people, spread Christianity, make God powerful, if you will. And we also call it westernize in some cases. So if you remember in American history, we looked at this political cartoon. We're talking about we are trying to carry people up to civilization, and these are the people that we are taking over. And these are the people that Great Britain is taking over. So again, all of this is because of imperialism. All this is because of the Industrial Revolution. So, true or false, the Industrial Revolution did not lead to imperialism. So, because of the Industrial Revolution, you're going to notice that that need for resources, again, the raw materials, are going to be needed in both Europe, and I'm going to throw the United States in here for this one. And we're going to look at different countries that have a lot of resources at their disposal. So, we're going to look at Africa. You could also look at Asia and Latin America. However, we're going to really focus in on Africa. And if you look at this list of European countries that had control of the continent of Africa, that's a lot. And their presence is still felt here in 2022. So, where this all comes about is in this thing called the Berlin Conference, and they call it the Scramble of Africa. And this is all the representatives from their countries with a map of Africa saying which chunk are they going to control. And what they were carving out is now the borderlines, backtracking on this slide, are the borderlines of today's countries, if you will. And the reason why they did this was to have a peaceful way of doing this, air quote, not leading to conflict. But you know what the kicker is? There is no African tribes or people invited to this. So this is somebody running your life in a way. So here's a quick rundown of the countries and what they owned. You already saw the map, but this is what France owned. It's what Britain owned. This is what Germany owned. This is what Belgium owned. And then this is what the world looked like. And again, if you go back in year to actually read on those slides, they all have their piece in world history. But if we had more time, we could go more in depth. But for the nuts and bolts of things, countries in Europe taking over other countries in parts of Africa. for their stuff, if you will. So this is up to the year 1914. This is when World War One is going to break out, because imperialism is actually a reason why World War One is going to break out, because people are super duper jealous of how much country and how much other lands that they controlled. So this is why World War One had a hand in starting. So the continent that was most imperialized during this time was